The paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your sense of aesthetics, you will not be able to see my face today, my geriatric visage, because I haven't been paying my bookie his requisite interest every week. Well, no, actually, that's not the case. I'm currently driving from Southern California to the Cascade Mountains in Washington. I'm in Northern California now, about to embark into Oregon, and I've been looking for roadside stands where I can purchase some peace, love, and brown rice, but I just haven't been able to find them. Maybe as I get a little bit further into Oregon, I'll be able to purchase some peace, love, and brown rice. I was in Southern California for 3 weeks, and last Monday I buried my uncle, who was a 100% disabled Vietnam vet. And throughout the last 3 weeks, I've done a lot of ruminating on his life and my life and where we're at now. Well, actually, he's 6 feet under, and I'm driving north on Highway 5. But he was one of the many Americans that volunteered for active duty to fight the Red Menace in Vietnam. And unfortunately, that entire war was predicated on a lie, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And 60,000 American boys and millions of Vietnamese lost their lives over the lie that is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Today we're going to hear from a blackmail photographer named Rusty Nelson, but I think that there might have been some blackmail involved in going to war after the quote-unquote Gulf of Tonkin incident. Bobby Baker was Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man, and he ran the Quorum Club, which was a place where power brokers like congressmen could meet young women or have assignations with young women. Many were prostitutes, and actually one was a Soviet spy. Her name was Ellen Ramesh, and she had affairs, according to Bobby Baker, with both JFK and Gerald Ford. So I wonder how many of our lawmakers were blackmailed into the U.S. going to war for the Gulf of Tonkin, or the lies that were the Gulf of Tonkin. And it never ceases to amaze me that this is an equation that's completely left out of American politics, is the blackmailing of our politicians, because politicians, I think, would be relatively easy to blackmail. As I've said before, nothing makes people stupid, like even smart people, like sex, money, and power. And our politicians have that trifecta. So, and as I've said on this podcast before, if love is blind, lust is deaf, dumb, and quadriplegic. So as I've thought about my uncle's life and how it had been disfigured by Vietnam, I thought about the lies that went into making all those American boys go to Vietnam, and just the carnage, not only with people like my uncle, who I loved dearly, and but also with, as I said, millions of Vietnamese. On Monday, I gave the eulogy for my uncle, and I'm usually good. I've done a lot of public speaking. I'm usually good at separating my head and my heart. And as I gave his eulogy, I was just overcome by emotion. It was very, very it was very, very uncharacteristic of me to just break out bawling in front of a number of people who I'm trying to deliver, for lack of a better word, a speech to. And all those years, my uncle and I, we were very, very close. And my mother and I moved in with my grandmother when I was 4 years old, and my uncle was a senior in high school. And he was almost like a big brother to me. And occasionally he would get on my nerves, and I don't know, we acquired a French poodle named Frenchie, appropriately. And Frenchie loved to break from the screen door like a thoroughbred breaking from the gate. And every time I opened that screen door, Uncle Al would run after Frenchie, after shouting a number of expletives. So I knew if I wanted to get rid of Uncle Al for a while, all I had to do was pop open that screen door. Although he loved me, he probably looked at me as the nephew from hell. So getting back to Blackmail, you're going to hear my second interview with Rusty Nelson. He was a blackmail photographer for the Lawrence E. King, Craig Spence child trafficking network. And in this interview, he actually confesses to being a blackmail photographer. Now, Rusty can be an unsavory fellow, but with an investigation like the Franklin scandal, it took me into a lot of really dark places. As I've mentioned, it took me into a crack house, it took me to homeless shelters, it took me to projects, and it ultimately took me to a prison. So it's very difficult to go into a story that dark and not have to be subsumed by the darkness. And once I decided to go for Franklin and give it my best, I knew that I was going to have to go into the darker crevices of humanity. And I was actually going to have to be non-judgmental to people whose behavior would otherwise be anathema to me if I was going to get this story, because I was going to have to get them to talk. And Rusty Nelson is one such case. He and I communicated for quite some time. And I do believe that Rusty was very honest to me early on. I believe that the interview that you're about to hear, Rusty was being very honest. And what happened with Rusty, there's a BC and an AD with Rusty. I think he was very honest with me until a certain point, and he found a girlfriend, and he moved into her place. And Rusty does love photography, whether it's illegal or not illegal. And his girlfriend footed the bill for him to start a photographic studio. And shortly thereafter, I think within a day or two, it was raided by the Nebraska State Patrol, which was very dirty in covering up the Franklin scandal. And all of his equipment was impounded. And Rusty kind of lost his mind. And before, he'd really shunned internet conspiracy types. And after that, he started giving interviews to all kinds of people. And I knew that a number of the interviews that he was giving, he was not telling the truth. And I confronted him on it. And he more or less confessed to me that he wasn't exactly telling the truth with some of those interviews. And finally, with Rusty, because he had become so compromised as a source because of all the stuff that he was spewing to these internet loonies, I really challenged him to give me blackmail pictures. And he took me on a wild goose chase to get blackmail pictures. We did not get blackmail pictures. I do believe he did have blackmail pictures, and I do believe he did them did give them to Gary Caradori, but I think that was it. And I ultimately believe that Gary Caradori was killed because of those pictures. And I have a lot of corroboration in the Franklin scandal. But anyway, so Rusty took me on this wild goose chase to get pictures, and then we were on a thoroughfare in the heart of Nebraska between two large cornfields, and I got pulled over. And I opened the Franklin scandal with this. It was a Nebraska State Patrol officer, and he looked more like most of the Nebraska State Patrol officers I met were rather rotund and didn't strike me as the brightest bulbs. But this guy was sharp and he was in good shape, and I showed him my identification, my driver's license, and he didn't say anything, but he escorted me into his cruiser. And he ran me through, and I was clean. And then he went and talked to Rusty. And then he ran Rusty through, and there were a lot of numbers after Rusty, and I sensed that they were highly negative numbers. And then another officer showed up, and this guy looked more like a Nebraska State Patrol guy. He was corpulent, and he just didn't strike me as a rocket scientist. So I felt a little more at ease once that this guy showed up. He showed up with a dog, and they deposited Rusty in the other cruiser, and then these two Nebraska State Patrol officers completely ripped apart all of my possessions in the car. Everything. They went through everything. They did not find anything. And then they were kind enough to let Rusty and I go. I mean, we had to put everything back together, but yet they were kind enough to let us go. And as Rusty and I were driving away, Rusty turned to me and said, "You know how lucky you are?" And what he meant by that was, if we had had those blackmail pictures, they would have found them, and it would have been trouble for both of us. But with Franklin, I always tried to think a move or two ahead. And before I took off for Franklin, I'd done a video. And I said that what I was going to try to acquire with Rusty. So if I did, in fact, get busted with any type of illegal pictures, that video would back me up and show that it was in pursuit of Franklin. So I had that as a backdrop. But it was nonetheless very, very frightening, because we were there for a couple of hours, and I did not know exactly how they were going to come at us. The first Nebraska State Patrol officer said, he made me like a Vito Corleone. He said, "We can arrest you, impound your car, and search it, or else we can just search it now." So, I mean, at that point, given what I was investigating, and given that I was with Rusty Nelson, I didn't really want to shout out any ACLU buzzwords. So the interview that you're about to listen to with Rusty is very unique in a number of ways, because I do believe that he gave Gary Caradori the pictures that ultimately got Gary Caradori killed. And as I said, he is actually confessing to taking blackmail pictures. And it's the only time throughout the interviews that he's given that he's ever confessed to taking blackmail pictures. Alicia Owen had said that Rusty had videotaped her engaged in a sexual act. And Paul Benassi had also talked about Rusty. But for my Patreons, I've got 6 reports on an Omaha Police Department child pornography investigation that involves Lawrence E. King and Rusty Nelson. So the Omaha Police Department had put together Lawrence E. King and Rusty Nelson as far as purported child pornographers. Unfortunately, as I delineate in the Franklin scandal, that particular investigation was sawed off. The investigating officers, Earl Carmine, was livid because he thought that Wadman had sawed off that investigation. And as it turned out, Wadman and King were friends, although Wadman denied that. And both Alicia and Paul Benassi would be indicted. Alicia would be indicted on a number of counts because she talked about being molested by OPD Chief Robert Wadman, and Paul Benassi talked about witnessing Robert Wadman molesting Alicia Owen. As for myself, I have no doubts that Rusty Nelson was a blackmail photographer, amongst other things, for Lawrence E. King. Once you listen to this interview, it will open your eyes to a lot of things. As I said, you'll never probably ever hear another blackmail photographer being interviewed, or you probably certainly haven't before. And for my Patreons, behind the Patreon wall, I've got 6 Omaha Police Department reports on the investigation of Lawrence King and Rusty Nelson for child pornography. So after you listen to the interview, go behind the paywall and you can look at the Omaha Police Chief or Omaha Police Department reports that really do show that Rusty Nelson and Lawrence E. King were connected.
It's August 31st, 2003, and I'm interviewing Rusty Nelson. So Rusty, when Franklin went down, the FBI came to your place or found you?
And they came in. They basically come to my mom's house and they harassed her, looking for me. I was in Omaha that weekend, and before I could make it back home, they'd already hit my doorstep at my folks' house. I was living in a different farmhouse, so they gave her a real hard time. And anyway, they basically gave her an ultimatum, make sure that he gets a hold of us or else. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think that I'd done anything wrong or that, so I went ahead and talked to him. I was reserved about it and that.
And what basically did they say to you?
Well, it was basically they wanted me to, they didn't directly come out and say it, but they sure implied that they wanted me to shut up, mm-hmm. be quiet, not say too much. And when they did come in, I met them, they went through and just ransacked Mom's house. They went through and they did my house. And they went through at a later date and did the same thing.
And what do you think they were looking for?
Supposedly they said they were looking for pictures that I'd taken for Larry King, kitty porn, something like that, but I wasn't into the shooting the kitty porn for him.
Uh-huh.
And that was the big falling out that Larry King and I basically had was I would not shoot the kitty porn nor the snuff films that he wanted me to shoot for him.
Now, did they say to you to leave town, or did you just...
They did not flat out in direct words say it, but they sure implied it, that they wanted me to get out of Dodge and basically become unavailable. I'd mentioned to them when they came over that I'd like a lawyer, and they were not too thrilled about me having a lawyer for it. What do you need a lawyer for and all that. So.
Now, you ultimately ended up in Albuquerque, mm-hmm. and that's where Gary Caradori found you?
Yeah, that would be basically, I came up to see Gary. I believe I was in Albuquerque. I was down in the Southwest.
And they had gotten a hold of you, and you had felt... Why did you decide to give the pictures to Gary Caradori?
Well, I was sick and tired of the FBI come in. They basically had ruined my life at that point. I had to leave the farm. I finally got settled in, had a life, It was pretty much decent, and I could live it. And that was pretty much the beginning and the end. And I was, up until that point, starting to get along good with Dad and get fences mended, so to speak.
Mhm.
And when they showed up on the doorstep, Dad went ape. He just absolutely ate shit.
So Gary Caradori contacted you when you were
He'd been trying to
and you returned his call.
get through the family and that, and I finally decided to, let him know.
And you brought those pictures to him in Chicago.
Yeah, I drove up, gave them to him, met with him very briefly, and got out of there. I was probably one of the last people I ever saw him alive.
And only Caradori and Lauren Schmidt knew who provided those pictures, as I understand.
I have no idea. He wasn't supposed to tell anyone.
Yeah,
That's
because that Lauren Schmidt knew.
hands down. That was one of the deals. It was supposed to be completely anonymous and no one at all was to know.